The really crazy thing about this reflection in action effect is that not only is it real, but even if I tell you about it, even if I do this and I tell you beforehand what's going to happen, because of the psychological effect, it still works. Even if you don't believe it's going to work, it still works. This is the great thing about scientifically backed management techniques, is that the science shows that you can do this. Someone might not believe you, or you can do it to yourself even, and it still works. You still see a huge improvement in the performance of the people you're working with.
It's 8 o'clock, so good morning to everybody who is here. We have once again David Sharp with us, who is going to be our speaker today. You know him from the podcast we did about liquefied natural gas a month ago. So thank you very much for joining us, David. Welcome this morning again. Well, David, I'm not going to waste any time on introducing you because we have the link already here. And I would like you to start just with the topic. The topic today is HR for performance management. And this is a topic which David came up with. Of course, this is something very specific and also very important nowadays, especially when we know how, let's say different cultures work. It relates to culture, corporate culture, also society and so on. So, David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Tim, as well. And thank you to our lovely audience for coming to listen. Good morning, everyone. My name is David, and today I'll be sharing with you some ideas about how to improve performance in your teams at work. A lot of my insights that I've gained over the years come from my education and from my experiences, but I really want to highlight the role that human resource management plays in making you a better team player, making you a better leader, a better manager, and as you progress in your career, becoming a high-performing CEO or entrepreneur. I'm going to explain these insights using real-world examples from my careers so far. Hopefully that'll keep it interesting. But I'm going to change some of the situations so that they're more anonymous and that I don't get into trouble from my previous companies and that nobody gets embarrassed. First, a little bit about myself. I'm currently working as a marine engineering officer on cruise ships. I'm 39 years old. In the last 20 years, I've attended the British Army Leadership Academy in Sandhurst. I've also worked as an English teacher in Japan. I've worked as an intercultural management supervisor for a large Japanese conglomerate, and I've worked as an engineer on container ships and on cruise ships. My first degree was in 2005, and I studied at the University of St Andrews in Fife, where I got to study a wide range of subjects from human anatomy to world religions across all departments. My second degree is a Master's in International Management and Leadership from Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh, where I graduated top of my class with distinction in 2012. And my third degree was in Marine Engineering and Naval Architecture from the City of Glasgow College in 2019. And I also currently hold an International Unlimited Engineering Officer professional licence. Okay, enough about me. Today, we're going to cover 6 key psychological principles that are scientifically researched and backed by human resource management findings. I've learned these and I've applied these to great effect in a lot of different management and leadership roles in and out of Japan, working with teams of monocultural people, dual cultural situations and multicultural situations. Some of these will be familiar to our audience because I know a lot of people here have MBAs, but it doesn't all come from the MBA pathway. It's my hope that we'll get some real practical ideas and practical methods of application delivered to you today so that you can go away with some actual actionable things that you can do in your workplace going forward. A lot of the techniques and principles we'll be covering have not been used in Japan very much in recent history because of Japanese cultural behaviors and the way that Japanese workers and managers relate to each other. But because of the demographic changes in Japan of lots more foreigners working here now, and because of the changes in the psychology and culture of Japanese young people, I think that these more psychological leadership tools are going to be used more and more in the future. So I strongly recommend you try them. There was a recent article in the Japan Times by Tamura Yuko that pointed out that 77% of Japanese workers don't want to become managers and aren't interested in promotion. And there was another article, I couldn't find the link, I'm sorry, but I was talking with Maya about it last week, I think, about a new finding that most Japanese young people see work as only being about money, not being about personal goals or achievement or anything. This is the new situation going forward. Japanese people historically have been very motivated, self-motivated. We're now going to be dealing with a population that aren't motivated. And as managers, we don't get given extra money by head office to spend to make our workers happier. So some of these psychological tools we'll be going through today are ones I strongly encourage that you learn and that you use going forward. So the 6 topics today, number 1 will be reflective practice. Number 2 will be a concept from the British Army called 2 up, 1 down. Number 3 is the learning organization. Number 4 is understanding your types of workers. Number 5 is the Pygmalion effect. And number 6 is action versus perception of action. Okay, let's jump right in. Number 1, reflective practice. I've chosen to start here because I feel that this is the most powerful psychological tool that I know of for improving your personal performance and for improving team performance. In the spring of 2013, I was working as an English teacher at an eikaiwa, that's a private evening English school, and I was asked to interview internally for a job with the company that owns and runs our brand of eikaiwas. I did well at the interview, and I was appointed to the position of area supervisor for the training department that would later become the compliance department. And this training department was run through head office, but also through local regional Shiten offices. So effectively, I was given 3 different bosses overnight and very little guidance as to what to do. Long story short, I was told I was in charge of customer satisfaction, product quality, and internal harmony at 8 different schools across Ibaraki, Chiba, Saitama, and Eastern Tokyo. I was given the job description of mentor and developing employee skills, attending meetings and seminars arranged by head office, and that's it. I wasn't given any guidance on how to do this. I wasn't given any budget. There was no mentoring. There was no team given to me. There was no onboarding. I didn't shadow another manager. The only resources I had as a new manager were my own time, my own efforts, my relationships, and my ideas. From a Western management point of view, this is kind of the worst of all possible scenarios. You've been given all the responsibility, but you've been given none of the resources and none of the authority to get anything done. So I was pretty terrified. And it's worth noting that at this point, large Japanese companies, for new managers, new workers, new interns, it's pretty common to be in this situation. I was talking to a German lady last week who's doing an internship at a very famous Japanese company. And she was saying the same thing. She'd stepped into her internship, and she'd not really been given any guidance or structure as to what to do. So it's a pretty common situation. So hopefully this advice for anyone who's new to Japan or coming to Japan will help you. I realized that this was an opportunity to sink or swim, and it was an opportunity to make the most, to show off what I really could bring to the company from my skills. So I thought back to my master's degree in international management and all the classes I'd studied, from strategic finance to supply chain management to new business development to research methodologies, and all these subjects that at the time I thought were really practical business subjects. None of them were helping me. And then it was the one kind of the hippy-dippy, psychological, esoteric, wishy-washy subject that really, then and now, is the center of everything I do as a manager. And this is a subject called reflective practice. It sounds a bit like meditation. It sounds like thinking and talking about your feelings. So when I was studying it, I never thought it'd become such a big part of the way I work. So the good news is none of you are going to have to take 3 semesters of reflective practice to master its secrets. I'm going to tell you the secrets right now. The main thing that the study of reflective practice from human resource management has found in its psychological research is that there are 2 types of reflection. There is reflection on action and there is reflection in action. I know we have some second language English speakers in the audience, so I'll break that down just so it's very clear. Reflection on action is after you've done an activity. That's when a manager comes to you after a task and says, "Oh, I noticed you worked on the sales account with Ayako yesterday. How did it go?" And then you think back and you say, "Oh, this went well, and this other thing also went well, but maybe we can improve X, Y, Z, or whatever." And that's a kind of normal kind of interaction in the workplace, nothing special there. Reflection in action is much more forward-looking. That's when, as a manager, I come to you and I say, "After you work on the sales account with Ayako tomorrow, I'd be interested on hearing your thoughts on how it went. So let's have a meeting afterwards around 5 p.m. This is a very small difference, but it makes a huge amount of difference when it comes to the performance during the task. Because I've asked you before the task to prepare your thoughts for delivering some notes afterwards, it causes you, whether you want to or not, it causes you to be more present, to be more focused, to be more aware during the task, which means fewer mistakes happen, which means you perform better. And because you're performing better over time as an employee or as a worker, you actually become happier as well, which is fantastic news. The really crazy thing about this reflection in action effect is that not only is it real, but even if I tell you about it, even if I do this and I tell you beforehand what's going to happen, because of the psychological effect, it still works. Even if you don't believe it's going to work, it still works. This is the great thing about scientifically backed management techniques, is that the science shows that you can do this. Someone might not believe you, or you can do it to yourself even, which will come to my next example, and it still works. You still see a huge improvement in the performance of the people you're working with. So back to my terrifying management job. There I was. I started my new management job, responsible for 8 different schools, 10 teachers and managers and assistant managers and receptionists and salespeople at each school. No resources, no money, no team, no backing from head office, and I'm supposed to help everybody improve their performance. So using this idea of reflection in action, I created just a very simple bunch of questions that I would ask my employees, and I would ask them, 3 months from now, what would you like to be better at? And some people say, I want to have a better relationship with my coworkers. I want to improve my communication skills. Even, especially when managing non-Japanese, I know it's a little strange to a Japanese person or culturally Japanese to include non-work things, but this even works with outside of the workplace activities. So some people answered, I want to learn a martial art. I want to be better at Japanese. I want to, have a fun life as well as a fun work environment. And so I sat down with each of my employees and I asked them, 3 months from now, what do you want to see improved? And we came up with an individual mentoring program for each of them. And every 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, we'd sit down, and rather than saying, how did it go? My focus, I didn't really ask about that. My focus is going forward in the next 3 months, what do you want to improve? Because of this psychological principle, I know that I've caused them to be more focused, more attentive, more aware of their actions in the workplace going forward. And this will lead to less mistakes, better performance, and more happiness. And happiness is really key to this. So 12 months later, I saw the results. The other 2 area supervisors, one for Central Tokyo and one for West Tokyo, and we worked together on some head office projects, and I got to know them well. So I was able to track and compare customer satisfaction data from their areas and staff retention rates from their areas to mine. And very, very much to my pleasure, the area that I worked in, we had the highest customer satisfaction ratings, and our staff retention was also the highest, almost 100%. Only 3 or 4 people quit or didn't recontract when I was area supervisor. So this is the power of psychology. This is the power of taking the lessons from the human resource research and applying it to your work life, no matter whether you work in operations, you work in sales, or even you can apply it to yourself. A second example of how this psychological principle works, more recently I've been acting as a career coach to a gentleman who's going to be moving to Japan next year. He's academically very serious and hardworking, but he wanted to improve his knowledge so that when he's studying things, he's not just taking information in and writing reports and forgetting about it. He saw other professionals in this area having really deep conversations with the information at their fingertips, and he wanted to have this ability. So using the principle of reflection in action, I came up with a plan. As his coach, I told him to sit down every morning and read his area of interest, which I think is economics for him, but it could be Korean language, it could be Taiwanese poetry, it doesn't matter. You sit down every morning and you read about your area of interest for 20 minutes. But after you've read, you must close all the articles and you have to write 200 words summarizing what you've just read. And again, because I've already explained the psychology behind this, you know that what's going to happen is that whilst he's reading, his brain, his psychology is already deeper. It's already focused on this information much more carefully, because he knows that afterwards he has to present that information. And the really crazy thing is that even on the days when he forgets to write or doesn't have time to write the 200 words afterwards, because the brain is more focused during the activity, he's going to see those performance benefits anyway. So after enough time, if you do this for months and months on end, on anything you're interested in, you automatically start becoming more aware in your general life, and you start just being able to read things and keep the information longer and have the information available to you for conversation. which makes life more interesting and makes your performance go up. Okay, that was quite a long one. So that's number one, reflective practice. I strongly advise you have a look into it and you start to apply it both in your daily lives and in the workplace. You'll be really pleased and surprised at how much performance can improve. The second one is from my time in the British Army. It's a concept called 2 up, 1 down. I was reading Frank Foley's Tales from the Gemba last week while I was traveling to Tokyo for Maya's networking event, which was amazing, by the way. I strongly recommend you come to more networking events if you don't. And he's got a small section in his book talking about the country managers being a bridge between head office overseas and also his or her 2IC or second in command. The British Army's management concept is similar, but instead of one person above, it's two above. So 2 up, 1 down, one works like this. Everybody in the organization is told from the moment they join that it's their responsibility to be aware of what their boss is doing and why. Also, to be aware of what their boss's boss is doing and why. And also, third thing, to be aware of what their immediate subordinate is doing and why. This solves 3 major problems that corporations and startups face. 1, it helps to get rid of most micromanagement, because each person is only taking an interest in the person one step below them. You're trusting that the person below them and below them and below them is being looked after by someone else. So it's a good way to build in an anti-micromanagement culture. Second, it means that each person in the organization has a strong situational awareness of the goals and the intent of the broader organization and the larger team, which means that if, like myself or the German lady I mentioned earlier, you join a Japanese company and you're not given any tasks for the first 3 weeks, or you're given no guidance, you know how to use that free time, or you know how to get involved in projects, because if you know the broad direction, the larger goals of the company, you can start to make your own tasks. You can start to be productive without needing someone to give you direct instructions. And the third benefit of this technique is it helps bosses get used to answering reasonable questions from subordinates. This is going to be a big one in Japan going forward, because with more and more foreigners working in Japanese companies and more young people in Japan being exposed to foreign media and foreign culture and being less willing to just do the job because they were told to do the job, bosses in Japan, in order to be effective, are going to have to get used to answering questions from subordinates. And if we build in this structure, then bosses know from the beginning that the person one below them will be asking what and will be asking why questions. And it's part of their responsibility as the boss to explain to their junior colleagues. And that will help the junior colleagues feel more included, which will make them feel part of the team, and it'll help to get us away from this I only work for the money type of culture that we see creeping in at the moment. Okay, that's number 2, quite a useful one. Number 3 is a concept called the learning organization. This is a deep kind of human resource management concept from the area of research that's called organizational behavior. It's one of my favorite areas of research, but if you haven't done an MBA or a business degree, you might not have heard of it. Most Japanese organizations, most organizations in the world, in fact, operate on a very old concept of where information lives. And it's not true, basically. So most companies believe that information lives, the company culture, the company policies, the procedures, the workplace behaviors, the customer. They believe that they can write these things down in manuals and booklets and websites and in their accounting information. And in fact, there's one very famous Japanese company that a friend of mine used to work for, and they required that whenever any employee retired, that they'd sit for I think 4 or 5 months with a special team, and they would write down everything they could remember about this project or that project or this activity, just to try and get all the information out of the employee before they retire and before they leave. Now, the research shows that this isn't actually how information works. The learning organization concept has been tested again and again by human resource people, and it shows that the information lives in the people who make up the organization. It doesn't live in the books, it lives in the people. It seems like quite an obvious idea, like a lot of management ideas. People can say, oh, that's kind of obvious. But the question then is, if it's obvious, why are companies in Japan and the rest of the world failing to understand this? Basically, if you change your team members, I mean, you can keep your brand name, you can keep your suppliers, you can keep your customers, you can keep your product, your services. But if you completely replace each of the humans in your team, you effectively don't have the same organization anymore. You won't have the same teamwork, you won't have the same company culture, you won't have the same performance, you won't have the same strengths of the relationships, you won't have the same weaknesses either. Now, if we understand this concept, then that means when we're talking with HR as operational managers, or we're talking with head office, then we have a very strong argument in favor of keeping and retraining team members instead of replacing them with new ones. Usually, we only have to make this financial argument. It'll cost 3 months and so many salaries to find and recruit and to train a new person. But the cost to an organization of losing someone is so much more than that, because each person has unique skills, knowledge, experiences, and understandings that if we lose them, that all of that leaves. You can't write any of that down. Or if you do write it down, the words sit on the page and nothing actually happens. It's not actionable information. So in terms of making this a real life example, I see this every time I go to sea. The ship can be the same physical ship, but each person comes and goes on a different schedule. So the crew and the officers on the ship in December could be 100% different people with different capabilities to the ship in July. And it can be possible to have a joint project between the engine and deck departments to renovate all the ship's tanks, for example, in December. But with the July crew, and the July head office believes that they're exactly the same capabilities, same qualifications, same training, same tools, same manuals, same equipment. But the July crew might not even be able to organise a proper coordinated training schedule between departments just because of personality or other factors. So that's the importance of keeping your people and the psychological reasons why we need to do that. So number 4, I'll try and I had 10 topics I wanted to talk about today and realised I didn't have enough time. So we'll try and get to all 6 if you'll stay with me. So number 4 is understanding your types of workers. There are a lot of different tools for understanding why some teams fail and why some teams succeed. And as a manager, we're often expected to achieve results, as I've said already, without being given extra budgets or extra tools or extra people. And one of the key things that human resource departments do is they work towards diversity in organizations and across all levels of organizations. What we can do as operational managers or sales team managers with the same type of human resource research tools is we can ensure that when that diversity comes to us, we're going to organize our teams to give our teams the highest chance of performance success. And to do that, we really need to understand the 2 main types of co-workers. So again, I learned about this on my MBA Master's Business Degree equivalent. I also learned about this when I'm at sea. There's a course every seagoing officer, deck department and engine department both has to do called HELM, Human Element Leadership and Management. We do this course about once every 3 or 4 years just to keep us relevant. And it was really gratifying to see some of the lessons that I'd learned on my master's degree are also on these professional courses. So yeah, there isn't really a sexy name for this principle. The research is called the least preferred co-worker scale, which doesn't roll off the tongue, but it's one of my favorite research topics. And if we have a drink sometime, I could talk to you about this for hours. So please don't get me started. So the researcher who developed it was an American called Fiedler, and he didn't really realize what he was studying when he started it. He asked people to describe their least preferred coworker. And he didn't really know the results he was doing. He wasn't looking for a specific answer. But when the results came out, he found there were 2 very general, very rough types of co-workers. There were people who complain about other co-workers being bad at a specific task, and there are people who complain about co-workers based around personal behaviours. So Fiedler broke these into 2 types of people: goal-oriented people and people who are relationship-oriented. And again, like a lot of management research, we can say that's pretty obvious. We didn't need a study to prove that, but the research was deeper and it gets very interesting. Turns out that when you get individual performance and you get team performance, if you put a person who's a goal-focused individual into a team full of relationship individuals, they don't get along well, they have conflicts, they don't work well together. So one of the ideas coming out of this is that when you get your team, or your team, say you've got 30 people, you need to split them into 3 teams of 10, then a good strategy is to try and put all of the task-focused people onto one team, try and put all the relationship-focused people onto another team. This is a point in organization where you don't want to be mixing different types of people too much. And the reason for that is that the way the team relates to the environment is really powerful. There are 3 types of environments. First is the really hierarchical environment with lots of rules, lots of defined roles and duties. We can see that in Japanese traditional corporate life. The second environment is when there are no rules, no roles, no clearly explained behaviors. We see that in the startup world. And then the third environment, which is the tricky one, it's kind of halfway. There's almost a hierarchy, but it's kind of vague, and there are some rules, but they're more like guidelines, and there's a kind of plan, but it's a rough plan. So we have the three different environments: very strict, very free, and very vague. And it wasn't obvious at all which group, maybe would the goal-focused group of people be better in one environment or the other. It wasn't obvious at all which would be the case. But we get a very interesting result when the information comes in. Goal-oriented groups of individuals, they perform really well when there's a strong hierarchy, when they know what the rules are, they know what the game is, and they can just work, and that's fine. Also, very surprisingly, goal-oriented people work very well when there are no rules, when there's no guidance, when there's nothing at all. And that kind of surprised a lot of researchers. But it turns out what happens is if you take one of these goal-oriented people and you put them into a no-rule situation, because of their personality and their motivational type, they automatically create a new hierarchy. They become the new hierarchy. So goal-oriented groups work very well when they join a hierarchy, and they also work very well when there is no rules because they have the freedom to make their own performance hierarchy. The relationship-oriented people are very interesting because they do terribly when it's a strict hierarchy, and they do very badly when it's total freedom. But they do really, really well when it's this vague, ambiguous, changeable kind of situation. And that's where the diversity from HR comes in, because you need both types of groups, and both types of groups have a role to play. So when you're starting up an organization, you want a small team of goal-focused people. But then when you're in the middle and you might have to pivot your product, you don't really know what you're going to sell, who your customer's just changed because a new legislation's come in, that vague environment. You need these relationship-focused people because the goal-oriented people will just quit out of frustration. And then once you've got through that and you've got a defined product and a defined market and you need efficiency rather than flexibility, that's when you want to be hiring the goal-oriented people again. So that's a real lesson we can all learn from the different types of environments and matching the environment to the motivational type, whether it's goal or human oriented. One real life example of this is that when I'm on the ship and I'm working as an engineering officer, one of my emergency duties is to be the team leader of one of our 4 fire teams in case of emergencies such as flooding or collision or indeed fire. So when the fire alarm or the drill alarm goes, I hand off my duties to the engine room to somebody else. I go sit up with my team with their breathing gear. We grab the axes and the hoses, and we go to the central coordinating point, and we'll be deployed to fight the fire from there. One of the fire team members, he was really struggling to perform his duties well. And just like in corporate Japan, when you can't hire and fire people on a ship, you're in the middle of the ocean, replacing somebody isn't an option. You've got to find a way as a manager to help them perform their tasks better, so they can be a full team player. So I knew the gentleman in question, and he normally was a good worker. So I spoke with our other fire team leader and our mutual boss, the fire commander, and we did some extra training. We did the training, still no improvement. I suggested he join my fire team because with my military background, in an emergency team, I've got a very direct and clear leadership style, and I thought that might make him calmer and happier. Kind of using this idea that if he's a goal-oriented person, he might be happier with a stricter, more directed environment. And it seemed to work. It seemed to solve the problem. Other managers, it's very tempting, especially when we're working in Japan in this multicultural environment, it's very tempting to go instantly to maybe it's a cultural problem, maybe it's a diversity problem, maybe he's from one island in the Philippines, but the other team members are from a different island in the Philippines. Maybe he's Asian and his team leader was Italian, and the Italian leadership style was a lot more relaxed and sharing of responsibility, and that was the problem. None of that was the case. In the end, he's a kind of goal-focused person who performs really well when he's given strict rules and strict guidelines, and that was the solution. So the lesson here for us as Japanese intercultural professionals is that yes, we can draw upon intercultural research, but often it's not simpler, but it's more individual, it's more human than that, and sometimes we should look at the motivational style or the team working style of the specific person rather than jumping to a broad cultural issue, which might not be the real problem. Okay, number 5, very quickly, the Pygmalion effect. It's a very short and simple one, but a very powerful one. The Pygmalion effect is basically the idea that people behave the way you expect them to behave. You might have seen it in your own lives, but I was coaching a lady about her sales performance, and her sales were going down and down and down, and she was really taking a knock to her confidence. And I just told her I disagreed. I just told her I think she's a natural communicator. She's really good at her job. And it's not lying. It's having a psychological impact on people. With the Pygmalion effect, you tell someone you believe in them. You tell someone they're really good and they can perform well. And that gives them the first little step, the first confidence boost they need to take a risk, to do a little bit more, to put themselves out there. And very often we can see just by telling people that we believe that they're good at their jobs, they start to actually become good at their jobs. In her case, she ended up being someone that other people would go to for advice because she'd managed to turn around her performance so well. So as a new manager in a Japanese organization, you might be, as a foreigner who's a manager, you might unfortunately be given the low performing team, or the team that nobody else has been able to get to perform. And I've done this both in Japan and at sea. I've been given teams that I knew were not the most popular of teams from a management point of view. But if you go in and you go, it's the bad team, it's the low performing team, they will reflect that back at you. They will see your lack of enthusiasm and they will reflect it right back at you. So the advice here using this Pygmalion effect is that if you go in and you tell people, I requested this team, this is the best team, this is the team that is the fastest, you just find any metric that they happen to be good at and you really talk them up, then over only a couple of weeks, they'll start to believe their own propaganda and they start to actually elicit the behavior or demonstrate the behaviors that we want in them. So that's the power of believing in others. And that's kind of when you're a manager, you're also a coach and you're also a guide and you're kind of helping your team be as good as they can be. I know I'm a little bit over time, Maya, but I've got one more principle, if that's okay. Hopefully it's a fun story for everybody.
Yes,
So
sure.
is that okay? It's I know it's the most controversial of the 6 topics, so I'm hoping we can get a little bit of discussion out of this one. Hopefully it'll make a few people smile as well. Right. Okay. Here we go. So this is a kind of the Japanese versus foreign management bias for action versus the perception of action. You need to be very careful with this one. So one of the trickier aspects of dealing with a dual cultural workplace, such as foreigners and Japanese, is that over time, the mixture of foreigners, whether it's Canadians and Indians and Argentinians, or whether it's Afghanis and Scottish people or Irish, over time in Japan, the foreigners tend to make their own kind of internal cultural group. And the Japanese, because this is Japan, because every day we go home to Japanese homes and we drive on Japanese roads, the Japanese group kind of remains a separate faction. If you go to Germany, you'll find the same thing. The Germans are one group, and then the Japanese, the Koreans, the Irish, and the Canadians become like the internationals. So, working in some international environments, you have to deal with multiple cultures. But for most of us, it's just the Japanese cultural group and the mixed international cultural group. So anyway. This was back when I was the area supervisor, and I got an emergency call from one school manager saying that she was ready to quit and that one of her teachers was also ready to quit and that I needed to come to this school immediately to help her with her paperwork for quitting. And the good news is I managed to get them both not to quit. So let's see how I did that and what cultural and psychological tools I used. And then I'm open to advice and criticism of how I could have done it better, or maybe I made some mistakes, and hopefully a bit more interesting than the more academic stuff we just covered. So the problem was a deeply culturally rooted one. The Australian teacher felt it was within his right to use spare offices in the workplace between his scheduled work when he was free as a place to relax, just like everybody else did. Except his idea of relaxing was meditating, and he was a kind of a Western New Age hippie Buddhist guy. So he also brought his meditation equipment to work, which was like a nice rug and a special bell that he would ring the bell at the beginning and the end of his meditations. I hope a few eyebrows are being raised in the audience about this already. The Japanese school manager, she was deeply upset that one of her team would use the office space not to relax, but to obviously relax. And she was unable to communicate to him that you can relax, but you can't be seen to be relaxing. And that was an interesting cultural issue. But she was also horrified because from her Japanese eyes, her Japanese point of view, this was a white Western Christian, she assumed, and he was kind of insulting or kind of playing Buddhism as cosplaying as a Buddhist as a kind of game. And also, he didn't know, but the bell he was using, which he thought was just a cool Buddhist bell, to her was a funeral bell, and she'd recently had a member of her family pass away. So, like some deep emotions there, some really deep cultural differences about what's appropriate, what you can do, and all this sort of thing. And she tried to speak to the teacher, and he tried to explain to her, and the relationship had completely broken down, and the school manager was threatening to resign, the teacher was threatening to resign. So I arrive at the school, I go into crisis management mode straight away, I separate the two of them, I speak to them individually, I sit down with the Japanese manager, and I just listen. I just listen and I nod and I agree with as much as what I agree or say nothing to as much as what she says as possible. She's calmed down a little bit. I go to speak to the Australian teacher and I do the exact same. So this is an instance where, despite the cultural difference, the initial strategy is the same. I listen to his side of the story. I agree with him as much as possible to show him I'm on his side. I ensure him as well that personal issues like this aren't measured or aren't reflected in the KPIs of class quality or customer interaction or customer, none of that. So once we've got this resolved, and we will get this resolved, none of this is going to reflect on his appraisals for work or his performance or his bonus, and nothing like that's going to happen. This is a purely personal issue, and that managed to calm him down quite a lot. The second step was, when they're in separate rooms, I try to just keep them separated and calm them down for as long as possible. Often just time and letting people cool off is the best strategy, and that's something straight from the human resource management handbook. The number of times you've arranged a meeting with human resources and they've delayed it or whatever, it's better not to deal with people who have a complaint or an issue, unless it's like a criminal complaint in the workplace. If it's a personal complaint, very often the strategy is to just let people calm down. So in step 3, I got the manager to come up with a wish list of the real measurable behaviours she would like to see in the teacher going forward. I asked her to dream really hard on this, come up with an absolute wish list of the perfect things she'd wish to see from this teacher. And by getting her to go that extra mile with all these, some very, not unreasonable, but very advanced demands, I was able to get from her a commitment that if I could get the Australian guy to show some of these behaviours, that she would forgive him, set the relationship back to zero, continue to work there, just start from fresh. And we all three of us delete this incident from our memories and it would be fine. I explained to the Australian teacher that I'd consider it a personal favour if he'd look at some of the very reasonable requests that the manager made. I tried to really pitch this to him. And in the end, I managed to get them both to, I just printed something, I made it up basically. I got them both sign a pledge to work towards getting the relationship back together, to work on the activities on the list, and to work on respecting each other in the workplace. So fortunately, this took about 3 hours to do, but it worked. And both of them remained with the company even 8 months later by the time I was leaving the company to do something else. But why did it work? And that's where I'm open to ideas from the audience, because this was a real emergency crisis. I was in kind of panic mode and I did the best I could. But thinking back on it, I believe what might have been happening is that the Japanese manager wanted to see the foreign employee who was misbehaving. She wanted to see that head office was taking her problem seriously. That was me turning up and treating her with respect. They wanted to see the employee who was a problem being disciplined in front of the group. That was important to her culturally. And by taking him aside and acting very stern and serious, she was satisfied that he'd been punished in front of the group. And that's why she backed down. From the Australian teacher's point of view, he was happy to trust my personal guarantees that this was just a behavioural blip. It won't be recorded on any staff performance reviews unless it becomes a constant chronic kind of behavioural problem. And he appreciated it that when I spoke to him in a very casual, very open way that indicated he was in my circle of trust and that I was only interested in getting him back to work. I wasn't interested in punishment or anything silly like this. And somehow I was able to both satisfy the school manager's cultural needs and also satisfy this Australian gentleman's cultural needs. And they both went back to work. And as far as I heard, checking up on them every week or every month, things were great after that. So I've run a little bit over time, Maya, but the main lesson here is operational managers, sales managers, CEOs, we often hear the words human resource management and we're terrified because these are the people who hire and fire everybody or do disciplinary things. But the wealth of psychological knowledge that the human resource area of study in business has shown us is really valuable. And again, the key message throughout this is, as managers, especially in Japan, you will not be given a budget. You will not be given extra employees or colleagues to work with or schedules. Your real tools are good psychology and good relationships. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for listening. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you, David. Well, it was really insightful and very informative. And I was listening to you, and I agree with you actually on most of the points. But there are some things, from my own experience here in Japan that go against one or two of the things that you mentioned. And of course, we all come from different experiences. So that's why I believe that there is, as you mentioned in the beginning, there is no one right way to do things or to develop.
Absolutely.
But I was thinking, for example, when you were talking, making the argument that it is important to keep and retrain your employees because, this is the people who build the organization, and the organization the organization exists because of the people. I agree with you on that. But at the same time, there is one thing that, from my experience so far, I have seen it, and I saw it actually quite recently in the previous workplace. So there are times when you simply cannot retrain your employees.
Yes, absolutely, Maya. I couldn't agree with you more. I've tried to condense 5 or 6 different subjects from my last 20 years of experience down to what I think is most actionable, what is most useful to our audience members going forward. But one of the reasons I suggest strongly that people go to the research and actually read up on it is you're absolutely right. Very often in companies, if you're an operational manager, then I think even 90% of your job as operational manager is trying to fix personality problems that should have been sorted by HR at the recruitment stage. Some people, like I said with this gentleman who was working on the fire teams with me, our first response was to try and retrain him. Turns out retraining didn't work. No matter this guy, he wasn't the type of person who was open to being trained. It wasn't even a personality issue. He just wasn't that capable. He'd reached the limits of his ability. He was never going to be promoted. We couldn't train him because it was just too complicated for him. So yeah, very often as a manager, especially in Japan, you're expected to solve problems that really the only solution is this person should never have been hired. This person is not a good fit culturally. This person does not have the skills. The resume says they're a Japanese N2 or N1, but actually that's just on paper. In terms of conversation, they're not able to communicate above an N3 level. But whatever the problem is, I completely agree that sometimes we can't fix the problems. But I figured rather than give a presentation about the downsides of management, these are some strategies that people can start with. And then, I've had one particular engineering colleague. I worked with the staff chief on my ship, and we retrained him, and then we got him to shadow me. And then I actually took over half of his jobs so that he could focus on a smaller number of responsibilities and get better at them. And once he had confidence, he'd come back to his full responsibilities. But in the end, the only solution we found was to and this is a legal issue now, but very carefully suggest to him that maybe working on a ship and working in engineering just isn't what he was put on God's earth to do. He's maybe suited for something else. And he's still a friend, and now he works as a DJ on a beach resort in Romania. So it worked out well for everyone in the end. But yeah, sometimes people are not trainable. But as a manager, if you go to your boss and say, hey boss, this guy isn't trainable, they're going to ask you, well, did you try to train them? Did you speak to HR? What psychology did you apply? Did you try to put them on a different team? Did you do all these things? But yeah, getting rid of them or moving them is going to be the last thing you're allowed to do as a manager. So that's why I didn't really cover it today, Maya. But you're absolutely right. That's a real problem.
Yeah, I think, yes, I agree with you that it could be a problem, or I would rather call it a challenge. But because I mentioned that, because I can see that I had a similar situation actually in my workplace. And what happened at the end was that the person who was not trainable found a different role with a different company, and they thrived there, just as in your case. And the thing is also that everything is situational once again, but
absolutely.
Also, yes, sometimes we expect human resources, the HR department, to solve problems at the point of hiring. And I would say that HR actually recruiting is like a marriage. It's so difficult to get the right person straight away. I'm at that point because people perform, right? They perform at their interviews, and even though they may perform well, at the end of the day, when they get into the role, it turns out, not all the time, but sometimes it turns out that they're not a good fit for that role. So
yeah, well, it's interesting, Maya. You say hiring or recruiting someone is like a marriage. And by that, of course, you mean everything's always smooth, there's never any arguments, and you're deeply in love for 30, 40, 50 years, right?
Yeah.
In reality, there are a lot of arguments. In reality, there are a lot of problems. There's a lot of growth, and yeah, you might not be a good fit for each other. It's just one of those things where we can recognize that we wish the problems were fixed either at the point of recruitment or the point of hiring. But very often we're told, you as a manager, you're going to be appraised on the performance of this team. And we know the team isn't a good team, and we know we shouldn't have hired this person, but they're here now, and it's your job to do the best that you can do. And it's a very tough position for managers, actually, in Japan. So very often, like I said, it's considered in Western management the worst possible situation, to be given all the responsibilities, but to be given none of the tools, that, as we would see it, the finance, the team, the backing. But I think it leads to a lot of creative solutions. Like you said, the same person can join a different company, and they can be in a different role or just a different relationship, and suddenly they're a really good performer. So, like the psychological principles that maybe HR should have applied at the recruitment process, even if they didn't, we can still take those psychological principles and we can use them to make sure that we have the teams that are. That's why I don't want to say that the teams should be performing fast or performing well or whatever. The teams should be performing the best they're able to perform. And sometimes you might be a goal-focused leader, and that might be your style, but you find yourself in charge of a team where everybody's relationship-focused. I found that a lot going from the British Army to being an English teacher. British Army, the entire thing is goals, 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 efficiency, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly I'm a manager at a corporate entity in Tokyo where nobody can be fired, nobody can be punished. And I had to very quickly change my own mindset so that I became a relationship-focused person. And my master's degree really helped me do that, actually. And this reflective practice thing, which I was pushing, that's the main, like the first 50 minutes we'll talk about this reflective practice, reflecting on yourself and seeing, well, how can I do better? How can I perform better? That really will help any manager to improve, because often you don't get to pick the team that you're in charge of, but you're still responsible for helping them be the best they can be. And if that means helping a relationship-focused team achieve modest goals in a vague environment, even though by nature you're naturally a goal-focused person who wants high-paced, big structure, targets and demands, well, no, you're the manager. It's your job to be flexible and to fit the team, not to force people to fit you, in my opinion. But
yeah, I agree with you on that. And I also think that there is something which we don't talk enough about, and that is empathy.
oh, yes.
I think that, of course, managers should actually combine both. They should be goal-oriented and, try to actually create an environment that is safe for everybody there, and, well, an environment where people can also focus on relationships as well. But I believe that as managers, we have to be empathetic, and not only be empathetic, but also show that empathy. Because if you show your empathy, if you lead by example, then even goal-oriented individuals will eventually, or most of them, maybe not everybody, but those individuals will eventually, try to see the team from a different perspective and the relationships there from a different perspective.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Maya. I think it's a maturity thing. I think a lot of people who, when they're young, they're goal-oriented, they don't understand, they don't appreciate the genuine contribution that relationship-oriented people can bring. And with time and experience, you really see that. I definitely started as a goal-oriented person, but at the same time, relationship-oriented people, as they mature and they get more world experience in the workplace, they'll notice that actually having that really hyper-focused person who's hitting deadlines, that's also a valuable contribution. And I think mutual respect between the two groups, and even the ability to change and become one or the other, is a skill that comes with emotional maturity and with experience. And that's the thing, is that people talk nowadays about being your authentic self and expressing your personality. Whether you're goal-oriented or whether you're relationship-oriented, just to take that one example, that's not who you are. That's not your personality. That's very largely a result of the environment and the upbringing you've been in. And if you wish to change, you can do so. I mean, if you join the military, you will become more goal-oriented. If you join a master's program, I mean, my master's degree was focused on third sector internships and like the charity sector. So when I did my big final report for them, it was about I managed to raise like $5,000 equivalent for a charity for disabled veterans by doing a hike. And yeah, that's a talk for another time. But the point is that if you reflect and you identify that I'm type A or type B, that's not fixed. You can change that if you wish to change that. And everyone has a contribution to make, and we should really appreciate that our job as managers is to help people find the right place in the organization where they can contribute the most. Because if they're contributing the most, they're going to be happy, and if they're happy, I'm happy. And who doesn't want to work in a company like that? So,
yes, indeed. Great. Tim, from your experience, I know that, your experience has been in manufacturing in the beginning, and I know that manufacturing is basically results-oriented. And goal-oriented mostly, but it's very important that you get people on good terms with each other. So are there any points or is there anything that you want to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I don't have enough time to cover all the stuff that popped into my head listening to David's great presentation. But as somebody who was bridging these gaps, and again, this is Japanese manufacturing, so it doesn't necessarily apply to other Japanese industries. This happens to be an industry that the Japanese excel at, so that's kind of important to put there. But one of the things I found, both in Japanese companies in the U.S. as well as American companies, the one that I worked for as a plant manager, there was this tremendous tension between the HR department and the way I was doing things and the way the Japanese wanted to do things in the factory. There were HR policies that were working against what we were trying to do. And I actually saw a shift from the 1980s to the 1990s where HR became less an advocate of employees and more a protector of the company from lawsuits. They were kind of like the poor man's first line of defense. And then, if you got to get the lawyers involved, they come in later. So a lot of these policies were geared toward protecting the company. But I'll give you a specific example. My policy, and I learned it from the Japanese, and it was psychological. Don't blame the operator for mistakes. In fact, it's the manager's job to provide the conditions that will allow your subordinates to succeed. And if they don't succeed, it's most of it's on you. Not all of it, but a big chunk of it. So to put it in crude terms, in the US, the shit rolls downhill. In Japan, in the factory, it rolls uphill. Okay. And the HR department had a 3 strikes and you're out policy, which was punitive. So I would go to the errant operator, and I did this many times. I would apologize. I'm so sorry I didn't give you a good process. Again, I learned it from my Japanese mentors. And then I'd invite that person to be on our improvement team, and I would train them how to analyze the situation, basic industrial engineering principles, that were, facilitated, simplified, so these uneducated folks could understand it and apply it. They were smart people. And what I would do is, rather than creating a resentful employee, I would get valuable feedback because they do the job every day. They would own the solution. A lot of it was their idea. And so psychologically, they would be on board. And now they felt safe and that they weren't going to be blamed. And it took a long time for me. I was always fighting the HR department because they wanted me to write them up. But they called it a corrective action because they wanted to pretend they were doing total quality management. And what's so interesting about this is this basic philosophy really came from Deming, but it's also rooted in Confucian ideology, where the leader has to take responsibility for any discord created below them, at least in principle, if not in reality. So I was always battling the HR department. And again, I know HR people are probably going to get mad at me. But here's one of the assumptions that I thought the Japanese made that was really good and also transferable across cultures. And that is that when people wake up in the morning, very few people say, I'm going to go to work today and do a crappy job. Most people want to do a good job. People are basically good. You see it in Shinto religion. You baptize kids not to get rid of original sin, but to make sure they remain protected and pure. So even in the religion, you see this idea that people are basically good. So if you manage from that perspective rather than the punitive, I found it was much more effective, not only in building teams and showing empathy and showing people that you care, but when you go out and you say, you know what, I'm sorry, I didn't give you a good enough process. Let's work together and do it. It drives fear out of the organization, which is what you need so people will reflect and want to continue doing Kaizen without fear of losing their jobs or making mistakes. So that's kind of just a counter to, I'm not saying all HR people are bad. I think they're great. I just think sometimes, certainly in the US, a litigious culture has created this kind of different role that's kind of at odds with the Kaizen philosophy.
No, I understand what you're saying there, Tim. That's some really good insights. And one of the things I've noticed about HR, I mean, we can certainly learn from the psychology that their researchers have unearthed. The fact that they're not using a lot of it is a whole other discussion, which you're alluding to. But one of the interesting things I found with HR is that I'm talking about applying these management leadership principles, these team working principles. Like you said, if you treat people well, they work hard. If you treat them, assuming that they're going to work badly, then that kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The people end up feeling that you don't trust them, so they don't work, blah, blah, blah. Um, yeah, I just feel that a lot of HR people manage the managers. Like I was when I was in working in Tokyo, after I'd implemented my own kind of motivational psychology related plans to interview people to cause them to work more presently in the moment, to cause them to be happier, to cause them to do all these things. I was doing all this with no backing, and at the end of the year, I got my first appraisal from the company, and I got an interview with HR internally as a junior manager, and they sat me down and they did the exact same thing to me. They applied this psychology to me, and I was like, "Oh my goodness! I've just realized what's happening. I'm managing my team as if they're team members who are capable of being managed." But corporate Japan in this particular company, because I was now a manager, I was now a human. I was someone that they could manage, they could psychologically manipulate, they could invest in, they could get bonuses. They saw the teachers in the schools as product. They didn't see them as people. And that's why human resources department didn't spend any time or effort actually trying to develop or enhance or to grow those human resources. It's a really crazy thing that I noticed. I've seen it, like you said, in corporate culture in America and other places, that once you get high up in an organization, middle or higher, then suddenly the human resources department becomes this place you can go to for advice, where they can give you guidance, where they've got all these clever psychological tools you can learn about and you can apply. But why the organization isn't applying those to the guy who's actually fixing the hole in the ship, or the guy who's welding together the piece of the engine, or the lady who's working over in that office there, or whatever? Why these HR professionals don't really apply those more advanced techniques to all the people in the organization is a bit of a mystery to me. But I'm hoping that maybe we can shame them into action if they see operations managers and sales managers and team leaders outside their department doing HR better than they're doing HR, where they just become the police and we're actually applying psychology to improve performance. Then maybe it'll cause a few more organizations to say, hold on a minute, we don't need an HR department. Our managers are all HR trained. Our managers are doing the HR, and our HR department can now return to its original role, which was the department that makes sure you get paid on time, which is kind of where they came from before they grew into this much larger entity. So I don't know, that's one possible strategy going forward. But.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, David. But I also tend to think that, well, of course, depending on the size of the company and what stage of its development the company is, definitely the human resource departments are there, maybe not so much to manage people directly, but to create the systems and the tools and to make those tools available to the managers, so
Yes.
that those managers, they can actually manage their teams.
Yeah.
But of course, it depends on the size of the company. And
but I'll tell you, I mean, we often interact with HR whenever a mistake has happened, and in the engine room there are lots of different pieces of equipment, and there's lots of different officers or non-officers who are in charge of these pieces of equipment. I was given a new, very complicated, very critical piece of equipment, because I work on a cruise ship, and if this water reclamation plant, if it stopped working, then all the guests would have no showers, no baths, no toilets. The cooks wouldn't have any water. So I was suddenly put in charge of this, and within 3 hours of me being in charge, we had a major fault, and the systems broke down. And we did an investigation, found out what happened. One of the operators, he made a mistake. It's a simple mistake. He made a mistake. And I had a wonderful boss at the time, a staff chief engineer, who happened to be Bulgarian, Maya. And I was terrified he was going to rip my face off, and I was going to get in deep trouble, and my operator was going to get in trouble, and all that sort of thing. And he came over and he laughed, and he said, "Well, you won't do that again." And so we took it, and it's a really, on that particular ship, they had a really great attitude of this learning from our mistakes point of view, not failing to deal with the mistakes, but actually learning from the mistakes. And it was HR again that backed us up with this. So it's not always true that HR departments are punitive and want to punish people. Our HR officer on that particular ship, he was very much behind this idea that people learn from their mistakes, and that when you write someone up as having a bad performance, that's not a negative. It's a sign that their manager needs to do more work to help them improve their performance. So I definitely think that HR and operations management can work together. And I think the first step in that path is operations managers reading some of the HR research, understanding where HR are coming from, because from an outsider, some of these psychological tools, some of these legislative rules make no sense when you're down operating the machine that makes the beer, or you're operating the sales team that sells the magazines, and these policies from HR come down and they don't make any sense. So just, again, more relationships, better communication, understanding where the other person's coming from will hopefully fix a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I agree on that. Well, thank you so very much. We're already 7 minutes past 9 o'clock. So
I'm sorry.
No, you don't have to be sorry. It's been just a great discussion. Thank you for preparing for it. And thank you to everybody who stayed with us and listened to us. This has been Japan Expert Insights, the Wednesday morning room, when we talk about business in Japan and, issues here about corporate culture and other challenges we have. And, that's all for the moment. So, David, once again, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you for having me, Maya. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. To everybody who is here, have a great day. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.